Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Red Donkey Projections. I'm Lucas. I have Eric here as always.
Hey guys,
And today we'll be making our predictions, our official predictions for the Georgia runoff elections that are happening in 3 days. We'll be making more predictions for this runoff as we get closer and closer to the election. We'll make an official final one right before Tuesday, which is when the runoff is. But for today, we'll make our second official prediction, and we'll be taking a look at polling data, which I know is not reliable. So we'll be taking a look at a lot more other sources. We'll also be discussing uh, about the implications of this race and how this will impact the entire United States Senate for the next 2 years of Joe Biden's presidential term. And with that being said, let's get right into it.
so one important factor that we really have to take into account in this election is the early turnout in general, and early turnout that has been accumulating before the actual election. As the headline says in this article, more than 3 million people have already voted. And we'll later in the video we'll talk about a specific sect in that number that is really going to help John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, the Democratic challengers. And if we look back into the 2020 presidential race, Georgia's early turnout, yeah, I'll compare with Georgia and Florida. Georgia's early turnout was arguably of 80% of the reason why I went to Joe Biden, and the lack of turnout in Miami, Florida, was part of the reason why Joe Biden lost by 3 points. So in this case, we can probably and should be using turnout as a pretty important number, because these aren't polls, right? This isn't a survey. This is the actual number of people that are actually filling out the official ballot. And for context, both races are on the same ballot.
Right, exactly. And this is very, very, very high turnout. And generally, turnout does help the Democrats. 2020 might be the first election where it didn't help the Democrats. It actually did kind of help Donald Trump because there was a lot of turnout from both sides. However, we do think that early voting is a very, very important factor in making our predictions now, especially considering how we were able to use it during the presidential election to figure out who would win Florida and who would win Georgia. And we'll discuss again further in this video about why this number, even though it has 3 million, we'll discuss specifically how this does support that John Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock do have a pretty good shot of winning these two races. So let's discuss everyone's favorite factor, polling. So I'll be honest, polling has not been great. 2020, the election, the polling was terrible. However, I do want to say that Georgia polls were not that far off. Some of the polls were only a few points off. And I want to point out Survey USA, which did come pretty close to getting it correctly. I think it was like 1 point off or less than a point off, but I think it was pretty accurate, and we can probably use that data here. And overall, we are not going to make our predictions solely based on polls, but what we are going to see is this is an indication. It is a slight indication for us, maybe it'll go one way or the other. And right now, what we're seeing is John Ossoff at 1.2 points in the polls, and Reverend Raphael Warnock at 1.8 points in the polls, leading Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue. As we mentioned earlier in other videos, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue are not the most liked people right now, especially by the Democrats. Kelly Loeffler and I believe David Perdue also, they were involved with a insider trading scandal, which really might not reflect well on them. And I know Reverend Raphael Warnock used it a lot in his debate, but David Perdue did not attend that debate with John Ossoff. Essentially, we can see the change here. This went from being, Perdue leading in the Ossoff race to now we see Ossoff himself leading. And I think throughout the election, before the election actually occurred, like before it went to a runoff, we saw David Perdue consistently leading. And quite frankly, I was a little bit surprised when it did go to runoff, this race in particular, that it went into a runoff. I thought David Perdue would win outright, but it does seem to be that Ossoff is gaining some steam here according to these averages. And Warnock has been up as well, which has also been quite interesting to see. And let's go to the Survey USA poll that we're discussing right now. Right now, it does show Reverend Raphael Warnock leading by 7, and John Ossoff leading by 5. Adjusted, that would be Ossoff 4, Warnock 5. Again, we're not going to trust these numbers 100%. There's no way that Ossoff or Warnock win by this much. It's going to be very close. But this is an indicator to us that it is interesting that maybe they do have a pretty good shot of winning this. So some of the other polls here, Gravis Marketing is a terrible pollster. We're not going to rely on that. This JMC Analytics, I don't believe that this is a very trusted pollster, but it is interesting to see this. Trafalgar, again, not a good pollster. A lot of these pollsters are really not the best ones. Emerson is interesting in that it shows Purdue up by 2 and Loeffler up by 2. But I guess we got to wait and see what else the other polls that come out do show. But again, our faith in polls have greatly diminished, especially after this election.
Another specific sect to focus on in that 3 million number in terms of early turnout is the African American portion of it. Georgia has a pretty significant African American population in comparison to the rest of the United States. And as this article touches on, it was probably the Black early turnout that really skewed Georgia to the left. And people praise Stacey Abrams for registering 800,000 people to vote. As an African American, she really did express the African American vote. And now, as as this article touches on, it is very, the African American vote is really driving the turnout, and people are relying on the African Americans to vote for Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, as most African Americans usually vote Democratic.
Right, and the key here is for Democrats is to drive up that African American turnout. If they can get the African turnout to a certain level, they'll be able to outweigh the voters from other races or specifically the white race, that might not be as secure for the Democrats as the African Americans are, using strengthened numbers, for example.
Mm-hmm. Another interesting statistic that I was reading about is that there is actually quite a significant amount of people who turned 18, which is the minimum voting age, after the general election, that are eligible to vote in this special election. And this is usually, 18-year-olds. They're a fairly young generation that have the opportunity to vote. And, these days, a lot of younger people, are, millennial age. They like to vote to for the Democrats. And a lot of Georgians and Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, they are relying on this younger generation that could also help, win out Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue.
Exactly. And what it's all about is if the Democrats, if Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock are able to notch enough voters with blacks, enough voters with whites, if they can get the levels of those races to be high enough, they'll be able to win this race. And from what we've seen right now with the increased black turnout, it's looking pretty good for Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, because as Eric said, the black people usually do tend to vote for the Democrats overwhelmingly. And if they can get enough black voters out, they'll be able to win this election. So, as you all know, probably, Georgia is the path for the Democrats or the Republicans to a majority here. The Senate composition right now is 50 to 48. However, if the Democrats can pick up both Georgia's runoff races, they'll win the Senate, because Vice President Kamala Harris would break any ties. Now, this is kind of an interesting situation, because the Democrats were supposed to win some of these Senate races that they didn't. They were supposed to take Maine. They were supposed to take North Carolina potentially, but that didn't happen. So here we are now. So discussing Georgia now, our final predictions for this. What are we thinking? Eric, why don't you put your thoughts on this first?
Yeah. So there's no doubt that this race is really, really close. And everyone knows that, and everyone, as we've said multiple times throughout this video, the balance of the Senate hinges on these two races. And we have to take into account whether the Georgia presidential one for Joe Biden was merely a fluke, or it is an actual trend that Georgia is leaning to the left. And these elections aren't that far off. And, there's a lot of people out there who are saying, this isn't over, Democratic advocates that are saying, this isn't over. and we still have to vote one more time in order for you to get the legislation that you want from Joe Biden. And what I think is going to happen is that for now, the Democrats do have the slight edge. David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler and a lot of conservative politicians are once again doing their best to hold on to these seats. They also understand that, they're gonna if the Democrats win these two seats, obviously they take the Senate and they're gonna allow for Joe Biden to enact legislation that they necessarily don't want. So, but the thing is, I'm noticing that Ossoff and Warnock, specifically Ossoff, are campaigning more effectively, and they are getting a lot of famous people that are trying to express the Georgia young and African American vote, which is why I think at the moment Ossoff and Warnock have the slightest edge. But once again, we cannot underestimate that Georgia is still quite a conservative state. Yes, Biden took it, but he didn't win in any blowout margin. It was a tilt. Georgia went in the tilt, less than 1 point. So there is still a conservative foundation in Georgia that could vote for the Republicans and overtake the Democrats. But as of right now, I do think that Democrats have the slightest edge based on turnout.
And I absolutely agree with you on that. And it's taking into account lots of factors that we probably should have taken into account during the presidential election, because we relied, 50% on polls, which we probably shouldn't have. What Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock have to do if they want to win, they have to run up the numbers in the Atlanta suburbs, which is around this area. I believe that Warnock, I'm not too sure about, but I know that Ossoff did run behind Biden in the Atlanta suburbs, and that ultimately is why he did end up getting less of the vote than David Perdue did, because Biden performed extraordinarily well in the Atlanta suburbs. But if they want to win, if David Perdue and Raphael Warnock want to win, they've got to increase the vote here, and they've got to run up the margins, run up the numbers, and they can win the state or win the runoff by taking the Atlanta suburbs. But I absolutely agree with you on this. I think this is a tilt D race at the moment. It's the slimmest of tilt D races. I think that's definitely going to be less than a percentage point. I wish I could give you a range, but that's kind of hard to do. But I think around like 0.4, 0.6, somewhere around there, that they will win it. And I know that there is this opinion out there that that hot take that Jon Ossoff will run ahead of Raphael Warnock. I know God of Politics does think that will happen. I do not think that will happen. I do think that Warnock will be running ahead of Jon Ossoff. But again, it is hard to tell right now. But I do not think this will be a split ticket. I think the chance of it being a split ticket is pretty unlikely, which basically means that a Republican wins on one ticket, but a Democrat wins on the other. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that it's either going to be both Warnock and Ossoff, or both Loeffler and Perdue. And at the moment, I agree with you, Eric. These two races are probably going to both go to, I don't want to say probably, but they do have a slight edge to Warnock and Ossoff.
The tilt of all tilts.
That is correct. And that is the end of it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like this episode, please hit the like button. If you like our content, please subscribe. We'll see you in our next episode tomorrow.
See ya.